So I'm going to run through briefly what we do, the sort of issues that we look at, the types of global, economic and also electronic crime that we do research on, and also what's going to happen in the future, the areas of future work that we look at. So firstly, how are sophisticated crimes committed? So things like credit card fraud or internet crime that Raymond's already explained. Our sort of work doesn't deal with relatively simple crimes like breaking into cars and, assaulting people. It's reasonably clear what happens in those situations. In some of the sorts of cases that we look at, we're trying to figure out how people do things that are quite complex. And the crooks go to inordinate lengths to cover their tracks, often using multiple bank accounts in different countries to hide what they're doing so they won't get detected. So actually, just figuring out what's happened is the first research task that we need to find out. Secondly, how many crimes are committed and what are the trends over time in crimes? And this is a question that applies to all of the work in the Institute. In this area, we're looking at crimes like fraud, offences of dishonesty. And unfortunately, the statistics aren't collected very uniformly and clearly in this area, and so it's again quite hard to know what's going on. There's another prize for the person who can explain what the bump around the 1989-90 period in reported fraud offences is due to. Any quick ideas? Yeah, there was a recession around then. Yes. They're probably small influences as it turns out. The more important influence is probably the fact that the police changed the way they collected fraud data. So who's committing these sorts of crimes and why are they committing it? And this is research that often involves interviewing offenders or looking at court transcripts to see why offences were committed. We did some work a few years ago looking at why fraudsters carry out their activities and categorise the different motivations that people have for their different offences. And you can see that greed, unsurprisingly, was the main motivation for fraudsters. But second most prevalent was gambling, problem gambling and people involved in stealing funds to feed a gambling habit or to pay the debts that have been incurred through gambling activities, and a range of other influences there. So various reasons why people are committing financial crimes. How much money is at stake? This has occupied us for many years trying to actually put a figure on it. Governments and also the public like to know how much money is being lost through fraud, and we try and estimate with some pretty imaginative methodologies to figure out how much money actually is being defrauded in the country. It's about $8.5 billion lost to fraud across Australia at the moment. That's the latest estimate. That's clearly an underestimate. We do surveys or make use of surveys that are conducted by the Bureau of Statistics to try and find out how much money people are losing. This is a snapshot of the results of a survey of households conducted by the Bureau of Statistics a couple of years ago, in which they asked people how much money they'd lost and what the prevalence of victimisation due to consumer scams was. And you can see that it's almost $1 billion that people are forking out to scammers across Australia in one 12-month period. So very large sums of money people are getting defrauded of using scams. Identity fraud, 3% of the Australian population are being victimised by identity crimes in Australia at the moment. And how can we reduce these sorts of complex financial and transnational crimes? So what are the best ways to try and address them? Is it through technology, strategies that business can use, or simply locking people up? How effective is that? Should we use restorative justice approaches to dealing with fraudsters? Okay, methods. How do we go about collecting information? We do A lot of work using public source material. You know, a lot of our work is desk-based. There's enormous amounts of information, as you know, from the internet. Some of it less reliable than others, but we make use of reliable sources. Reviews of books, published academic works, and material from other government departments. Some of our people are legally trained. We do legislative and case law analysis to try and see what the problems are with legislation. Some of our work involves sentencing research to see what sanctions courts hand down to people and what the aggravating and mitigating factors are in sentencing. We talk to business, government and members of the public in interviews or in group discussions, roundtable discussions, to try and find out what their concerns are and how the sort of research we do could help them. Large-scale surveys of households, businesses. You can do surveys of offenders, sometimes interviewing offenders in jail, and victims of crimes. This is a very expensive part of the work that the Institute does, and we usually get funding from other government departments or research agencies to do that sort of work. And some analysis of media reporting. Sometimes crime information isn't reported to the police. It's not reported officially. It's very difficult to do surveys of victims. And one source of information is media reports, so we can analyse those and see what's happening with media reporting. And finally, disseminating the results of our research, which Janet's already talked about. So a range of publications, online resources. We give conference papers locally and internationally, and publish both institute publications and also ordinary commercial books and academic articles. Okay, now moving on to some of the sort of areas that my program covers. And the first deals with transnational and organised crime. As Peter Hummel mentioned, we do work with the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, which is an international body that sets some of the normative goals in crime control and responses to crime. We attend some of their meetings. They're based in Vienna, so we're forced to go over at great personal cost to listen to quite lengthy, I might add, discussions amongst representatives of 160 or so other countries. Some of our work looks at local problems involving organised crime, such as the role of organised motorcycle gangs and the responses. You know, should they be outlawed, as is starting to happen, and what are the effects of outlawing specific groups in the community like that? Jackie's mentioned her work on people trafficking. We also look at drug trafficking and other forms of trafficking, sometimes trafficking in endangered species or firearms. And some fairly esoteric topics to do with medical tourism, sex tourism, trade in organs. We've written papers in the past on surgical operations that have produced organs that are then sold internationally without the donor's consent. A lot of work on cross-border crime. Much of that involves financial transactions. So we've got cases of tax evasion and money laundering. I'll come back to that in a minute. Sam's already mentioned environmental crime. That's involving pollution. There is work on carbon pollution that we can contribute to, and climate change and the criminal opportunities that are there. Illegal logging and vegetation clearance, illegal trade in fauna and flora. And most recently, water theft, which is becoming not a problem just where your neighbour steals water from your storage next door, but more importantly where farmers misuse their allocation of water rights, which can involve very large sums of money.